Imagine trying to debunk one of the most influential and just systemically complex texts in all of human history.
Right. And doing it by claiming the author just, copied it from some blacksmith in a back alley.
Yeah, exactly. Which sounds ridiculous, but that is the actual historical mystery we're unraveling today.
It really is.
Because people throughout history, and even right there during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they often tried to dismiss the Quran by claiming he didn't receive divine revelation at all.
Right. They alleged he simply learned it from a foreigner.
Like, just some guy in Mecca, maybe a tradesman who was secretly passing him notes or something.
It's basically the ultimate attempt to demystify something that is mathematically and linguistically extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, you take a text that literally reshaped global civilization, you try to attribute its genius to this mundane, entirely human source.
But the text we are diving into today completely flips that script.
It really does. It asks a devastatingly logical question, which is, how could a non-native, quote-unquote, foreign mind produce a linguistic and systemic code that is just so perfectly mubin?
Right. And for you listening, mubin means absolutely clear, evident, and structurally flawless.
Exactly. The argument is that the mechanics of the language itself prove the source couldn't possibly be a human foreigner.
And that is the mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring a profoundly philosophical, highly analytical transcript from the Tulu Islam Digital Archive.
It's such a fascinating source.
It is. Specifically, we're looking at Lecture 13 out of a 15-part series by the thinker Allama Parwez.
Yeah, we're really unpacking his rationalist exegesis, his critical interpretation of the Quran.
Right, and we're zeroing in on Surah An-Nahl, which is chapter 16, verses 101 through 106.
And the stakes in these specific verses are just incredibly high.
Oh, totally.
Because the author is laying out the defense of revelation and the ethics of coercion.
Yeah, so this isn't just some dry theological debate about old texts.
Not at all. It is a really deep exploration of how the human mind intersects with divine logic.
And how pure reason, like cold, hard, anchored intellect, actually holds up under literal physical torture.
It's intense. But to get there, I want to start with how the author sets the foundation for this idea of pure reason.
Right, because he begins by tearing down a really widely held traditional concept known as Naskh.
Yeah, Naskh is the idea of abrogation.
Which is the belief that some verses of the Quran came along and essentially canceled out earlier verses.
Like a software update, basically.
Right, exactly. Like version 2.0 overwrites version 1.0 because the developers realized the original code had a bug.
Or maybe it just wasn't optimized for the new hardware, right?
Yeah. But the rationalist framework of this source completely rejects that entire software patch analogy.
Completely. The argument here is that a divine code, by its very definition, cannot have internal contradictions.
Or like expired rules.
Right. I mean, if we are talking about an ultimate architect of a universal system, the blueprint doesn't need mid-construction revisions.
Because mid-construction revisions imply that the architect failed to foresee a problem.
Exactly. Or, the architect is just reacting to human politics, changing the rules as the societal winds blow.
And the text is making a firm philosophical stand here. If you believe the code has to be constantly rewritten, you're treating it like a human constitution.
Right, and human laws need amendments because humans are short-sighted.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen in 50 years.
But the laws of physics don't need amendments. Gravity doesn't get a version 2.0.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The system is cohesive and permanent from day one.
Which forces a really strict definition of what Wahy or revelation actually is.
Because if it's a flawless, unchanging system, it cannot be the product of the human mind.
No, it can't. The text draws this uncompromising line between true Wahy and what we casually call intuition or inspiration.
Right, and the author brings in philosophers and poets to really illustrate this gap.
He specifically targets the French philosopher Henri Bergson.
And Bergson is a fascinating figure to bring into this.
He really is.
Because he viewed intuition not just as like a gut feeling, but as a higher form of intellect.
Yeah, for Bergson, intuition was almost this profound subconscious bubbling up of deep evolutionary understanding.
Right. It's the mind grasping the whole of a concept instantly without having to, consciously walk through the logical steps.
Exactly. And then the author also invokes the ancient Greek concept of the muse.
Oh, right, this external spirit that supposedly breathes poetry into an artist.
Yeah, and he pairs that with the Persian poetic concept of srosh, which is like an invisible messenger of inspiration.
That legendary poets like Mirza Ghalib were always crediting for their brilliance.
Exactly. Ghalib would compose something earth-shattering and basically claim the universe just whispered it to him.
And we still totally romanticize that today.
Oh, all the time?
Like, a musician writes a generational anthem and says, I didn't write it, it just came to me in a dream.
Or a novelist says the characters just started speaking to them.
Yeah, but the source text draws a massive line in the sand right here.
It does.
Yeah.
It insists that true Wahy is not Bergson's intuition.
Right.
It is not the Greek muse. And it is not the poet's srosh.
Because every single one of those phenomena, intuition, muses, artistic epiphanies, they're all ultimately internal.
Right. They are the product of the human mind's own background processing.
Yeah, the brain synthesizes your experiences, your emotions, your linguistic skills, all subconsciously.
And then it just delivers the result to the conscious mind in this flash of insight.
So it feels magical, but it is entirely self-generated.
Exactly. So if the prophet's revelation was just his own brilliant subconscious intuition bubbling up to the surface.
And he then turned around and told the world it was an external mandate from God.
Right. The author argues that would fundamentally be a fabrication.
It would be an internal thought passed off as objective reality.
Parwez insists that revelation is an objective, purely external download of systemic knowledge.
Meaning the human brain is just the receiver, not the generator.
Exactly. And to clarify the mechanics of this, the source points to the analogy of the honeybee.
Oh, right, which is actually referenced earlier in Surah An-Nahl.
Yeah. The text states that God placed Wahy inside the bee.
Okay.
And that is the exact mechanism that allows a tiny insect to fly miles away, gather nectar, navigate back to the hive.
And construct that mathematically precise hexagonal geometry, right?
Without any formal instruction whatsoever.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because I struggled with this analogy at first.
Yeah, so?
Well, if the text admits that a bee has this internal instinct given by God, a skeptic could easily argue that the prophet just had a highly evolved, divine, internal moral instinct.
Right, like God put the moral geometry inside him, just like the physical geometry inside the bee.
Exactly. Why couldn't that be the case?
Well, the source anticipates that exact philosophical trap.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the author distinguishes between the nature of the recipient. For the honeybee, Wahy is hardwired biological instinct.
Because the bee lacks free will.
Exactly. It doesn't sit around contemplating the structural integrity of a hexagon versus a square.
Right, it simply executes its programming.
But human beings operate on an entirely different plane.
Yeah, we have free will.
We have conflicting emotional desires and this vast intellectual capacity.
We can choose to build a terrible structure. We can choose to completely ignore our instincts.
Therefore, for a human being acting as a messenger, the Wahy cannot be an internal subconscious drive.
Because human internal drives are subject to emotional and psychological corruption.
Exactly. The source argues the Wahy must be strictly external.
So the prophet receives objective information, and his duty is purely mechanical in its transmission.
Yes. He must communicate it exactly as received without injecting his own philosophical spin.
Or his current emotional state.
Right. Or his personal commentary into the text itself.
And for anyone listening, distinguishing between objective data and subjective intuition is the absolute foundation of everything we're talking about today.
It really is the core of it all.
Because if the Quran was just the prophet's subjective intuition, you could argue with it subjectively.
You could simply say, you know, your intuition led you there, my intuition leads me here.
Right. But if it is an external objective code, like the boiling point of water,
then your personal feelings about it don't alter the reality of the code.
wow, yeah. And that objective reality requires a flawless vehicle for transmission.
Which brings us to the linguistic engineering of the Quran.
And this fascinating concept of Ruh al-Qudus mentioned in verse 102.
Yes, this is a crucial point in the lecture.
Because in a lot of traditional translations, Ruh al-Qudus is rendered as the Holy Spirit.
Right, and the mind immediately goes to mystical imagery.
Totally. A literal angel with wings, a ghost, some ethereal entity descending from the clouds to whisper in someone's ear.
But operating from its strict rationalist framework, the source strips away all of that anthropomorphic and mystical imagery.
So what does it actually mean, then?
The text defines Ruh al-Qudus as the pure logic of the system, or a specific divine energy in Amr.
An amr means a directive or a command, right?
Exactly. Its function is not to perform magic tricks.
Oh, okay.
It's to provide the human intellect with an unshakable, mathematically solid ground to stand on.
And the author talks about the natural psychological state of a human being without this anchor, doesn't he?
Yeah, he describes a mind in chaos, basically pulling in 100 different directions due to conflicting desires.
He used that phrase unity of individuality, or rather the lack of it.
Right, because without an external anchor, a person's like a fly, buzzing erratically from one shiny object to another.
Completely unsettled and constantly at war with themselves.
But the pure logic of the system is the cure for that internal wavering. It calibrates the personality.
That makes sense. But to deliver pure logic, you cannot use imprecise, fluid, poetic language.
Exactly. The language itself has to be engineered for systemic precision.
And this is where the author spends significant time demonstrating how the Quran completely re-engineered the Arabic vocabulary of the 7th century.
It's brilliant. It takes everyday, common Arabic words that the local tribes were already using.
And upgrades them into highly specific, locked-down systemic terms.
Right.
It's kind of comparable to taking the everyday word apple, a piece of fruit anyone can pick off a tree.
And turning it into a trademarked, multi-trillion-dollar tech ecosystem.
Exactly. Before Steve Jobs, an apple was just a snack.
Yeah.
After, it represents a highly specific architecture of hardware and software.
And the word sounds exactly the same, but the system behind it is entirely new.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And the text highlights the words salat and zakat to prove this point.
Right. In pre-Quranic Arabia, these words were used pretty loosely.
But the Quran attaches the definitive prefix al to them, locking them into a specialized vocabulary.
So salat becomes as-salat, zakat becomes as-zakat.
Let's actually look at the roots of those words, because that's where the architectural genius really shows.
Let's do it.
Because people casually translate zakat as just a charity tax.
Right, like you give a small percentage of your wealth to the poor, and you've fulfilled the requirement.
But the author digs into the pure linguistic root of zakat,
Which fundamentally means growth, development, and nourishment.
So it is not merely the act of dispensing surplus coins to alleviate immediate suffering.
No, the text argues that establishing zakat is a systemic mandate.
A mandate to build a societal structure that guarantees the holistic growth and nourishment of every single individual.
Both their physical bodies and their psychological selves, their personalities.
Right. It's the difference between tossing a life preserver to a drowning man, which is charity,
and building a seawall so the town never floods in the first place, which is zakat.
That is such a huge distinction.
It is. And that level of linguistic upgrading, taking a fluid word and forging it into a rigorous societal blueprint, is evidence of the Ruach Qudus.
Because a human being operating on poetic intuition uses words metaphorically.
But a systems architect uses terms with unyielding precision.
Which perfectly dismantles the counter-argument the critics were attempting to make in verse 103.
Yes, exactly. If the terminology is this sophisticated and this deeply rooted in the absolute mastery of Arabic linguistic structure,
then the whole foreigner myth completely collapses under its own weight.
it really does. Verse 103 directly confronts the critics, whispering that a specific human being was secretly tutoring the prophet.
Right. As we mentioned earlier, historical accounts suggest they were pointing to a foreign craftsman.
A blacksmith, usually, who lived in Mecca.
They were trying to say the prophet was just, slipping out at night, going to the blacksmith shop and taking dictation.
But the Quran's logical defense here is brilliantly simple.
What does it say?
It points out that the person they are accusing of being the mastermind speaks Ajami.
Okay, and in the cultural context of the time, Ajami meant foreign, non-native, or having a broken tongue, right?
Exactly. It was a term used for someone who couldn't navigate the complex grammar and poetry of fluent Arabic.
So the contrast drawn here is between Ajami and Mubin.
Yes. The Quran describes its own linguistic state as Arabic, that is Mubun, which is crystal clear, eloquently structured, and systemically flawless.
The logical trap is undeniable. You are claiming a man who struggles with basic conversational syntax is secretly dictating a masterwork.
A masterwork that is currently leaving the greatest native poets of your civilization utterly speechless.
It's almost comical when you put it like that.
And the historical context of Arab linguistic pride makes this defense even more potent.
Oh, right. Because the Arabs of that era considered themselves the absolute masters of eloquence.
Yes. The author emphasizes that they called themselves the Al-Aluka, the people of the language.
They were so fiercely proud of their poetic prowess that they actually referred to non-Arabs as Gumge.
which means mute or speechless.
Which is incredibly arrogant.
To their minds, if you couldn't speak Arabic with high poetic flair, you essentially had no voice at all.
Right. They held massive poetry competitions like the fairs of Ukaz.
Where the winning verses were literally hung on the Kaaba.
Language was their ultimate cultural currency.
It was everything.
Yeah.
So for the Quran to challenge these hyper-proud native speakers, using a text supposedly ghost-written by a mute foreigner.
It is not just illogical, it's almost satirical.
Exactly. And to solidify the defense, the text brings the prophet's own biography into the evidence pool.
By pointing to his 40-year track record prior to the onset of revelation.
Right. He wasn't some hermit isolated on a mountain for decades, concocting a manifesto.
He was an active member of society, he engaged in commerce, he traveled with caravans.
People interacted with him daily.
And in those 40 years, he was never known as a poet.
Never. He never participated in those poetry slams at UCAS.
He didn't write philosophical treatises or show any inclination toward drafting a complex socioeconomic and political ideology.
No, he was simply known for his baseline human integrity, his honesty and trustworthiness.
So the source imagines the prophet challenging his critics based on this shared history.
Right, saying, I have lived my entire life in your full view. Did you ever hear me recite a single line of poetry that resembled this?
Did I ever display this level of systemic philosophical depth before this exact moment?
The sudden, fully formed emergence of this comprehensive code is presented as empirical proof of its external origin.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Because the closeted genius theory is still a very common modern critique.
Oh, absolutely.
A skeptic looking at this might say, well, people harbor secret talents all the time.
Right.
What if he was just an intensely private genius? He spent 40 years observing the societal decay, quietly reading whatever texts he could find from traveling merchants.
Studying the power structures.
Exactly. And finally, when he had it perfectly refined at age 40, he debuted his masterpiece. Why is that impossible?
It's a fair question. But the text dismantles that possibility by examining the mechanics of the Quran's open challenge. Yeah. And crucially, the economic motives of the people trying to defeat him.
Right, because the Quran repeatedly challenges the entire world to produce even a single chapter that matches its systemic and linguistic perfection.
The famous bring one chapter like it challenge.
Right.
So consider the environment. The brilliant minds of Arabia, these master poets and linguists, vehemently hated his message.
Because his teachings were actively disrupting their social hierarchy.
And more importantly, he was threatening their economic monopolies.
Oh, totally. The Kaaba in Mecca was a massive center of pilgrimage and trade, controlled by the Quraysh tribe.
The prophet's message threatened to upend that entire wealth generation machine.
So they had every possible motivation, political, social, and deeply financial, to just shut him down completely.
Exactly. If the Quran were merely the product of a human genius who had studied in secret, these other human geniuses would have been able to reverse engineer it.
That makes sense. They could have analyzed his structural patterns, mimicked his cadence, copied his systemic use of Arabic roots.
And simply written a competing text that met the criteria.
But they didn't.
No. The fact that they were completely paralyzed, utterly unable to produce a countertext, despite their intense hatred, their motivation, and their absolute mastery of the language.
It serves as the text's final proof.
Right. A human code can be hacked by another human. This code remained impenetrable.
Wow. So we have established the text's argument for its own objective, unhackable perfection.
I have.
But that raises a pretty terrifying question.
Okay.
If this text is objectively perfect and the evidence is sitting right in front of them, what is the psychological fallout for the people who look directly at it and say, nope, I refuse to believe it?
Yes. This is where the source dives into verse 104.
Which outlines the engine of reason and the consequences of rejecting evidence.
Exactly. The verse states, those who do not believe in the ayat of Allah, Allah does not guide them.
Now, to a casual reader or someone raised with a very traditional Sunday school view of religion, that sounds incredibly anthropomorphic.
Right, it sounds like a petty deity throwing a tantrum.
Yeah, like, you hurt my feelings by not listening to me, so I'm taking my guidance away. Good luck in the dark.
But the rationalist framework of the source utterly rejects that emotional reading.
Because in the system, God does not throw tantrums.
Exactly. This verse is describing a natural law. It is pure, unemotional cause and effect.
And to really understand that, we have to look at the specific word used, ayat.
Yes, ayat.
In the Quranic vocabulary, ayat translates to signs, evidence, or data points.
It represents the raw, objective information of reality.
So the author argues that if you intentionally reject the raw data, you are mathematically and logically incapable of reaching a correct conclusion.
The lack of guidance is not an act of punishment inflicted from above.
It is the natural, inevitable result of ignoring the map.
Right. If your input is willfully incorrect, your output will be flawed.
The source uses a highly relatable analogy here involving a doctor, and I want to really unpack the mechanics of it.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
Imagine you are suffering from a severe illness. You go to a specialist.
Okay.
The doctor examines your symptoms, runs the blood work, looks at all the objective data, and hands you a prescription for a specific medicine.
And that prescription is the ayat. It is the directive based on pure logic.
Right. Now imagine you take that prescription, crumple it up, and say, I don't believe in this medicine. I reject your diagnosis.
Right.
And you go home and refuse to take the cure. What happens? Your fever spikes, the infection spreads, you suffer.
Exactly.
But, and this is the crucial point the author makes, the doctor isn't sitting in his office looking at your file and actively punishing you with a higher temperature out of spite.
No, the doctor isn't zapping you with a fever because you bruised his ego.
The fever is simply the biological consequence of rejecting the cure.
The author actually provides another brilliant analogy to drive the unemotional nature of this law home.
Oh, let's hear it.
The train timetable.
Okay, a train timetable.
Imagine the official timetable states that the express train to Lahore departs exactly at 7 a.m.
Right, so that timetable is the objective data point.
Exactly. Now, if you look at that timetable, decide you just don't believe it, and stroll onto the platform at 9 a.m.
You are going to find an empty track.
You miss the train.
Yeah.
Now, you can sit on your suitcase and curse the station master all you want.
But the station master didn't deprive you of your journey because he was angry with you.
Right, he is just running a mechanical system.
You chose to operate outside the parameters of the system, so the system's benefits no longer apply to you.
The logic is just airtight. You cannot negotiate with gravity.
Yeah.
If you step off a cliff, gravity doesn't pull you down out of malice. It pulls you down because that is the law of the system.
And we see this dynamic constantly in the modern era.
Oh, all the time. We are living through an age of unprecedented information overload.
We have massive amounts of ayat or data regarding economic disparities, climate patterns, public health crises.
And the most common human psychological defense mechanism is to just ignore the data.
Because accepting it would require us to change our behavior, which is inconvenient.
But rejecting systemic laws only guarantees systemic failure.
Wow.
The author establishes that true faith is not blind trust. It is a conscious intellectual acceptance of evidence.
Which brings us to the absolute thorniest philosophical dilemma of this entire deep dive.
Oh, definitely.
Because if true belief requires the intellect to analyze data and freely accept a system,
Right.
what happens when a powerful external force, like a tyrannical government or a hostile mob, tries to forcefully override that process?
Yeah, what happens when they try to force you to believe?
We are now entering the territory of verses 105 and 106.
Exploring what we might call social physics and the ethics of coercion.
The ethics of undercover integrity. It sounds like an espionage thriller.
It does sound like a movie title. But we are talking about the fundamental architecture of human rights and the freedom of conscience here.
Right.
The author establishes a baseline rule derived from the previous logic. Forced faith is a literal oxymoron.
Because faith is the intellectual assent to data.
Exactly. So it is mechanically impossible to force someone into being a believer.
Right. Like, I can hold a weapon to your head and demand you state that the sky is neon green.
And you will likely say the words to survive.
But I haven't altered your belief. Your intellect still registers the sky as blue. I have only coerced your tongue.
Exactly. And the source dives deep into the grim reality of extreme physical torture to explore this.
Okay, how so?
The author sets a scenario where a tyrannical power, like a dictator or an oppressive regime, applies unbearable physical pressure.
Demanding that you verbally denounce your deeply held convictions.
Right. And the divine system's ruling on this is profound.
What is the ruling?
If you are forced to utter the words of disbelief purely to save your life, but your heart and your intellect remain completely secure, at peace, and anchored in the truth,
You bear no guilt.
you bear absolutely no guilt.
The implications of that are just staggering.
They really are.
It means the system prioritizes the internal reality of the intellect over the external performance of the body.
Exactly. You can chain a person to a wall. You can break their bones.
You can force their vocal cords to vibrate and form specific syllables.
But you cannot force an intellect to agree.
It is the ultimate divine validation of the freedom of conscience.
And it acknowledges the biological reality of the human animal. The body has limits to pain. It has breaking points.
But the mind, the intellect anchored in that pure logic, is a sovereign territory that no torturer can actually breach.
Which provides immense psychological comfort.
It really does. It removes the burden of guilt from the victim of torture.
Essentially saying, if your body breaks under agony, the system does not
Yeah.
condemn you so long as your mind did not surrender.
However, the author is aggressively careful to construct a boundary here.
Yes, very careful. Because this allowance for coerced speech is not a blank check for everyday hypocrisy or casual lying.
Because human nature will immediately look for loopholes.
Oh, immediately. Someone could hear this and think, excellent! I can just conceal my beliefs or lie whenever it's socially or financially convenient to avoid friction.
Right, which is the exact psychological rot the author wants to prevent.
Exactly. He references Surah An-Nahl, chapter 63, to provide a rigorous, unforgiving definition of what actually constitutes a lie.
And what is that definition?
He defines a lie specifically as the act of severing your tongue from your heart for the sake of personal gain or deception, when you are not under life-threatening coercion.
Okay, so if you are lying to secure a corporate promotion,
Or to win a political debate.
or to cheat a business partner, or just to blend in with a crowd because you want to be popular.
In all of those scenarios, you have physical freedom. Your life is not in imminent danger.
Yet you willfully choose to misrepresent your internal state.
That is hypocrisy. That destroys the unity of individuality we discussed earlier.
Right, so the exception granted in verse 106 is exclusively for situations of extreme, unavoidable physical coercion where biological survival is the only thing at stake.
Exactly. Now, in the interest of full transparency and impartial reporting of our source material, we do need to address a very intense critique the author makes here.
Yes, we do, because the text gets into some heavy critique regarding other religious and political schools of thought.
Specifically, the author heavily criticizes the concept of taqiyya and calls out figures like Maulana Maududi.
Right. And just to define terms for you listening, taqiyya is a concept found in certain sectarian traditions that permits the concealment of one's faith or beliefs in times of danger or persecution.
And the author of our text argues fiercely against how this concept has been historically broadened and utilized.
His stance is that certain political movements have stretched this exception to normalize lying or deceit for political expediency.
He critiques the idea that you can lie if it benefits the strategic goals of your religious or political group.
Now, to be absolutely clear to you listening, we are neutrally reporting the author's strong philosophical position here.
Right. We aren't endorsing a specific sectarian viewpoint or taking sides.
We are just conveying the ideas contained in the original source material.
And the author's argument is absolute. The Quran strictly, unequivocally forbids lying for convenience, social maneuvering, or political strategy.
It only forgives coerced speech under absolute flesh and blood torture.
And even then, only if the internal integrity of the mind remains totally uncompromised.
And the author's intense focus on this boundary stems from his understanding of social physics, doesn't it?
Yes, because society operates on a network of trust.
Right. If lying is normalized for political gain or just minor conveniences, that network disintegrates.
The entire social fabric breaks down.
Because the baseline data of human interaction, which is honesty, can no longer be relied upon.
Exactly. So survival under extreme torture through coerced speech is permitted. The system forgives the breaking of the body.
But the source doesn't stop there. It points to a higher, much more awe-inspiring tier of human resilience.
It really does. The lecture shifts from discussing the baseline permission of survival to celebrating the absolute pinnacle of human courage.
Right, because while survival through verbal concession is allowed, the text sings the praises of those who refuse to give the tyrant even an inch.
Even an inch of verbal satisfaction, regardless of the physical cost.
And the author brings up a really cinematic, legendary historical example to illustrate this ultimate resilience.
The magicians of Pharaoh.
Yeah, the psychological dynamics of this confrontation are just incredible.
They are. Pharaoh is the archetype of the ultimate tyrant. He doesn't just rule, he claims divine authority over reality itself.
Right. And he gathers his greatest magicians, who are essentially the top scientists, illusionists, and intellects of his empire.
For a highly publicized showdown to publicly humiliate and defeat the prophet Moses.
The entire nation is assembled. The stakes are absolute political and spiritual power.
But when these highly trained intellects witness Moses' signs,
The Ayat, the objective data.
exactly, when they see the data, a massive psychological shift occurs.
Because they are experts in illusion, they instantly recognize that what Moses is presenting is not a trick.
It is objective reality. Their intellects immediately grasp and accept the pure logic of the system.
And without hesitation, right there in the dirt, in front of the tyrant who controls their wealth, their status, and their physical lives.
They fall down and publicly declare their belief in the truth.
And Pharaoh's reaction is predictably brutal.
Oh, absolutely. He threatens them with the most gruesome, agonizing torture imaginable.
He declares he will amputate their hands and feet on opposite sides and crucify every single one of them on the trunks of palm trees.
It is a threat specifically engineered to induce total psychological collapse and absolute physical terror.
But how do they respond? The text highlights their reaction beautifully.
They don't cower. They don't beg for a reprieve or try to negotiate a compromise.
No. They look directly at the most powerful, heavily armed man in the known world who is promising them a slow, agonizing death.
And they respond with what the author calls a life-illuminating smile.
A smile in the shadow of crucifixion. It gives me chills.
They tell Pharaoh, do whatever you want. Decree whatever you decree. You can only end our physical worldly life, but you cannot touch our systemic integrity.
Wow. And if we pull together every thread we've discussed today, this moment is the author's ultimate proof.
Proof of the power of a mind firmly anchored in the Ruh al-Qudus.
Because when the intellect is entirely convinced by the data, when it fully achieves that internal unity,
External physical threats are entirely defanged.
the body becomes a secondary concern to the truth.
The physical pain, while real, becomes irrelevant compared to the sovereign integrity of the mind.
It is the ultimate triumph of pure reason over brute force.
Pharaoh possessed all the swords, all the soldiers, and all the executioners.
But he unequivocally lost the battle the very second their intellects accepted the truth.
He could destroy their bodies, but he couldn't conquer their minds.
We often think of belief as something fragile, a delicate flame that needs to be sheltered from the harsh winds of reality.
But this text posits the exact opposite.
The intellect is the fortress. The body might be captured, it might be tortured, it might even be killed.
But the mind remains an untouchable, sovereign state.
It fundamentally changes how you view human conviction.
It really does.
Let's retrace the massive ground we've covered today.
We covered a lot.
We started by dismantling the myth of the back alley blacksmith, proving that the systemic, linguistic perfection of the text is objectively unhackable.
We explored the mechanics of cause and effect, how rejecting the raw data of reality naturally leads to a lack of guidance, completely devoid of petty divine anger.
And we ended by mapping the physics of human belief.
Discovering how true, intellectually anchored conviction is fundamentally immune to the worst physical coercion humanity can invent.
It's an intensely challenging framework.
It is, but I want to leave you, the listener, with a new angle to ponder that builds on everything we've unpacked.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text proves that physical torture cannot conquer a resolved intellect. Pharaoh couldn't break the magicians' minds with the threat of crucifixion.
Right.
But it makes you wonder about the environment we live in today. If physical coercion fails, what about algorithmic coercion?
Oh, wow. That is a terrifying pivot.
Think about it. In our digital age, our information feeds, our social media ecosystems, our online environments,
They are constantly, subtly shaping our desires, amplifying our fears.
and altering our perceptions of reality without ever laying a single physical finger on us.
So in a world where algorithms bypass the body entirely to manipulate the subconscious, is our freedom of conscience being hijacked?
Exactly. Are we quietly surrendering the fortress of the mind not to a tyrant holding a sword, but to an invisible algorithm curating a feed?
That is something to seriously mull over the next time you find yourself endlessly scrolling.
For sure.
Well, we've seen the incredible resilience of the mind against external force today. In the next part of this series, looking at Lecture 14 and 15,
Covering Ayat 114 to 119.
we are going to move from the ethics of the mind to the ethics of the table.
We will be exploring the rationalist meaning of halal and tayyib.
and discussing the fascinating idea that a society's diet is actually a direct reflection of its psychological health.
It's going to be a great discussion.
You absolutely won't want to miss it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.